Welcome to my 263rd video on my work with OO gauge. As requested, this will be a kit build video. It's about time I got around to building some of the kits in my stash anyway, and I said I'd do some in the winter, which has now most definitely arrived. I decided to do 4 Peco Wonderful Wagon kits first. Quite a few of the other kits I have on hand duplicate things I've already built and featured in videos. I did think I might have built one of these kits before, but it turns out that I was definitely wrong, as these are quite strange kits in many ways, and I would definitely have remembered if I'd dealt with all this before. I had 4 of these kits on hand, each a little different, so they went together quite well to illustrate the way these kits deal with various different types of wagons that they were made for. I will cover the building of all 4 kits in this video, so it will be a little long, although I will try to avoid unnecessary duplication. The 4 kits were 4 from top left clockwise: a 5-plank open wagon, a box car, a con-flat container wagon, and a 7-plank open wagon. As you may see, the boxes proclaim that they are complete kits, which many wagon kits are not. Couplings are very often not included, and sometimes other items such as wheels and bearings must be separately sourced. But these Peco Wonderful Wagon kits contain everything needed to build a working wagon, more or less, as we shall see. The boxes also specify that the kits include working axle box springs, and we'll see in detail what that means, and magni-simplex couplers, and I'm going to say right up front that I found the magni-simplex couplings to be the worst feature of these kits, and frankly a real curse. But again, full details to follow, including running attempts. I started with the 7-plank open wagon, and here are the contents of that kit unpacked. 2 identical sprues of black plastic parts, a 3rd small sprue of additional plastic parts, a die-cast metal wagon body with 2 plastic sole bars packed inside it, 3 sheets of card parts, 2 for the outside of the wagon and 1 for the interior, 2 small plastic bags, 1 containing wheels and bearings and the other axle frames and couplings, and a single sheet of instructions. Here you can see the metal wagon body and all of the plastic parts. The 2 main sprues have the buffer beams and coupling mounts, the axle boxes and springs, the brake gear and the buffers. The small sprue at bottom left contains risers to increase the height of the wagon sides, and the sole bars came as separate parts inside the wagon body. When I first saw this card sheet, I didn't actually really know what it was for, but it transpired that it was intended to form interior planking for the wagon. These 2 sheets provide the outside of the wagon, with planking, etc., and private owner markings. This bag contains 2 plastic axles with wheels, and 4 small bearings for the pinpoint ends of the axles. The bearings appear to be made of graphite, I think. This bag contains 2 stamped and folded sheet metal parts for the axle frames and all of the parts for the magni-simplex couplings. Here's the front side of the instruction sheet unfolded. And here's the back of that sheet. To make it easier for you to see the details of the instructions, I've photographed each side in halves. All of the kits I had came with these identical instructions, and you can see that it says right here at the top that these instructions cover the kits for a wide variety of wagons with various types of body and 9 or 10-foot wheelbase. Here's the bottom of the first side, covering the assembly of the wagon chassis. Here's the top of the back side, covering the additional plastic parts required to build up 7-plank wagons and closed wagons, and the folding card parts. And here's the bottom of that side, with a bit more on the card parts and details on the couplings. The kits came with magni-simplex couplings, but they did also include plastic parts to allow adaptation for fitting different types of couplings. Each sheet was also initialed and dated by the packer at bottom right. Most of these wagons are built around the same cast metal body part, which is the correct size for a 5-plank wagon, and then built up with plastic parts for 7-plank and closed wagons. The shallower wagons, conflat and 3-plank, do come with shallower metal bodies. There are many holes and slits in the bottom of the body to provide the attachment of plastic parts and the sheet metal axle frames. The instructions do warn that all of these holes in the body may not be fully opened through, so the first thing that needs to be done is to check and open out all of these holes and slits. For the most part, I was able to do this with a small pointed file, though I broke one file doing this, and in some cases I had to resort to drilling to open the holes through. There was also some flash on the inside of the metal body. I couldn't get a file in to effectively remove that flash, so I did what I could with small curved pliers. Here's the text in the instructions regarding preparation of the parts. I didn't actually find much flash on the plastic parts. As you may see here, the instructions recommend a rather strange way of attaching the plastic parts to the metal body. Rather than gluing the parts in place, we are instructed to pass the plastic pins through the holes in the metal body and then to melt the pins on the inside with a soldering iron. I was a bit tempted to just ignore this and glue the parts in place, but I didn't. I used the soldering iron method as per the instructions. The first parts to be attached are the sole bars and the buffer beam parts, which also include the mountings for the magni-simplex couplings. The sole bars have 4 pins each, and these push through the holes in the edge of the bottom of the body, which is quite easy to do so long as the holes have been opened and the pins cleared of flash. The buffer beam parts are a little more fiddly to get in place, as these have 3 small pins in a row towards the edge and then 1 larger pin in the centre of the coupling mount. I did a bit of filing on the metal body to get everything to sit down nicely. Generally the parts fitted together very well. Here is the inside of the body after those parts were fitted, but before attempting to melt the pins. So what you're seeing here are all of the plastic pins as they initially come through. I changed the tip of my soldering iron for this, as I generally use a thin, pointed tip for precise work. But this process seemed to call more for a flat tip. And here you can see the result of my melting efforts. Rather a mess, I'm afraid, but I don't really see how you'd do better. When you melt the plastic pins with the iron, the plastic tends to stick to the iron, so it's very hard to make anything like a neat job. And however neat you'd manage to be, you'd be bound to end up with some plastic sticking up from the bottom of the wagon, so the interior card won't be able to sit all the way down flat on the bottom. The instructions tell us to add the magni-simplex couplings next, if we're going to use them. I did fit the magni-simplex couplings that came with the kits, although, as you will see, I somewhat regretted this when it came to trying to run the wagons. The instructions seen here also cover fitting the sheet metal axle mountings. Here are the parts from the corresponding little bag, 2 metal axle mountings and parts for 2 magni-simplex couplings, each with a main coupling hook, a thin spring, a metal pin and a shouldered screw. This particular bag had 1 extra spring, although 2 out of the 3 were rather mangled. The instructions for assembling the magni-simplex couplings were on the other side of the sheet, as seen here. The metal pins are pushed into the coupling hooks. These are supposed to provide for magnetic uncoupling. I was tempted just to leave them off, as I don't expect to attempt automatic uncoupling of any type. The pins should just push fit, but I found that a touch of glue was sometimes necessary to hold them in place. The shouldered screws must hold the coupling hooks onto the mountings, but the plastic mountings are not pre-threaded at all. They just have a hole in them a bit smaller than the screws, so you have to start by force screwing the screws into the holes in the plastic mounts, which, as you may imagine, is easier said than done with these short slot-headed screws. Here are the instructions from an actual separate pack of Magni-Simplex couplings that I had on hand. These instructions are a bit clearer and more detailed than those with the kit. I was a bit unclear at first as to how the springs were supposed to fit. I eventually got this straight, as I'll show in detail a bit later. But honestly, it's all a bit futile, as my experience was that the springs were just too thin and weak and basically did absolutely nothing useful even when fitted properly. What the springs are supposed to do is to push the coupling hooks back into the straight position whenever those hooks are pushed to one side. The instructions say to fit the sheet metal axle mounts next by pushing their tabs through the slots in the wagon base. I did the first 3 kits the way the instructions said. When I got to the 4th kit, I believe I found a better way to do things. Once the tabs of the metal axle mounts are pushed through, they need to be folded over on the inside to hold the mounts in place. I found that using the blunt end of my tweezers was the easiest way to do this. Quite a bit of force is required. Oddly enough, slots were provided for these tabs to fit into so they wouldn't stick up from the wagon floor at all, but no recesses were provided for the plastic pins, so their melted ends did inevitably stick up. Instruction 3 here tells how to cut out and mount the plastic axle box parts. And here are the illustrations that correspond to those instructions, making clear exactly how to cut the parts from the sprue, fit the bearings, and then fit the axle boxes to the metal mountings. The plastic axle box parts of my first kit came a bit malformed, but not to the point where it was a major problem. Here are those parts cut from the sprues. Next, the bearings need to be fitted into the axle boxes. Here are the contents of the other small bag, 2 axles and 4 bearings. Pushing the bearings into the axle boxes is very tricky. The bearings are small and hard to hold, but what makes it really difficult is that the plastic is extremely soft and rubbery, so there's no real way to get a firm hold on the axle boxes, with them bending all over the place. I did my best to push in the bearings with the tip of my tweezers. By the time I got to the 4th kit, I concluded that a better way to do it was just to position the bearing over the hole in the axle box with the tweezers, point down, and then squeeze between finger and thumb to push the bearing into the hole with a finger. Next, the plastic axle box parts need to be fitted into the metal mounts, as seen here. Getting these in is extremely awkward. They have to be put in sideways on, as seen here, and the side of the wagon gets in the way. Then you need to rotate the plastic part to lock it in place, and finally hook the ends over the tabs on the mount. But as mentioned, these parts are made of extremely soft, bendy plastic, so getting hold of them and twisting them against resistance is next to impossible, rather like trying to pick a lock with a piece of cooked spaghetti. I'd rate doing this task as per the instructions about 8 on a difficulty scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is easy and 10 is functionally pretty much impossible. I did find a slightly better way of getting things together on my 4th kit. Once all 4 axle boxes have been fitted, the wagon is ready for the addition of the wheels, although the instructions never seem to mention actually adding the wheels, or did I miss that? Here's a close-up of one of the axle boxes in place. This one is a bit mangled from my attempts to get hold of it during the fitting process. These axle boxes are sprung, as the box says, in that the axle box itself can slide up and down in the metal frame, with the plastic leaf spring actually bending and then pushing the axle box back down. Next, we are instructed to adapt the brake parts as necessary and fit them. Here are the illustrations for those instructions. The main brake parts are provided on the sprues, with arms and brake shoes for both 9-foot and 10-foot wheelbase wagons, and you need to cut away the pieces that don't apply to the wagon you're currently building. Here are those brake parts as they come from the sprues, and you can see that they've got basically 2 sets of brake shoes at each end. Here I'm trying one of those brake parts against the wagon chassis. I couldn't really tell from trying it like this which pieces needed to be cut away. I got out a ruler and measured the distance between the axle boxes. 00 scale is a hair over 4 millimeters to the foot. The distance between these axle boxes is about 36 millimeters, making a 9-foot wheelbase. So I needed to cut off the outer set of brake shoes and parts. These parts fit again with the push the pin through and melt it method, but one of the required holes didn't go all the way through in this case, as seen at sort of top right. I couldn't open that hole with a file, so I had to use a bit in a pin vise, and then I finished off opening it up with a file. With the holes properly opened, the brake parts can be fitted up against the inside of the sole bars. The brake parts then have holes in the middle that fit over the pins on the inside of the brake hangers on the sole bars. Again, the pins need to be melted on the inside. You'd think there must be a better way to do this. The final plastic parts to come from the sprues are the brake levers and the buffers. And here are those parts detached. The buffers work quite cleverly. They just push through the holes in the buffer beam, and then the waist on the shaft of the buffer holds it in place so it won't come out again, and the end of the buffer shaft rests against the wings on the back of the buffer beam part, which act as springs since this plastic is so bendy, so you actually get sprung buffers. The brake levers need to be push-fitted to the sides of the wagon. There is a small hole in the sole bar at one end into which a pin at the top of the brake lever bar pushes. Then the pin on the other end of the brake lever pushes into the hole in the hanger at the centre of the sole bar. Here you can see both brake levers fitted. So this chassis is essentially complete, except that one of the coupling springs isn't in right and I haven't fitted the wheels, as the instructions never told me to, at least as far as I can see. Next, because this build is for a 7-plank wagon, and the metal body is only the height of a 5-plank wagon, the sides need to be extended with plastic parts, as shown at left here. Here are the written instructions for that. It does say that polystyrene cement will glue the plastic parts together. I wasn't sure about that given how rubbery the parts are. Some other type of glue needs to be used to attach the plastic parts to the metal body. Here are the plastic parts for the extension of the wagon walls. I cut these out and then glued them to the metal body using 3-in-1 glue. This doesn't give the strongest bond, but I didn't feel that a strong bond was needed here, as when the card sides are fitted, those will tend to hold the side extensions in place. I used poly cement on the plastic parts at the corners, although this proved a bit futile, as you'll see. Next, we're supposed to cut out and fit the card parts, as detailed here. And here are those card parts again. I put a new blade into my craft knife before starting to work on the card parts, as neat cutting would be really essential here. I cut out the card part for the wagon interior. I wasn't 100% clear where to cut at the edges, so I erred a bit to the outside. Then I used a steel ruler to make the necessary bends. As well as bending up all of the walls from the floor, the tabs on the ends of the sides need to be bent in so that they can be glued to the ends. I got out some rocket card glue to glue the card parts. This is what I use for assembling card building kits, etc., and I find it excellent for fixing card parts in place. I glued the wagon card interior into shape, using tweezers to hold the joints firmly to let the glue take. Rocket glue fixes quite quickly, so the joints don't need to be held for a long time. When I tried to fit the card interior into the wagon, I found that I couldn't do so, as the ridges formed by the attachment of the plastic parts for extending the walls prevented the card from going down at the ends. I had to remove the plastic end extensions in order to get the card interior into place. Then I refitted the plastic end extensions, re-gluing the corners with poly cement. The card interior stuck up quite a bit above the plastic side parts. The various melted plastic bits prevented it from being pushed any further down. I did glue the card interior in place with rocket glue. Next, I needed to trim the excess, which is mentioned in the instructions. I used a plastic box inside the wagon to give me something to press against to start cutting through the card. Then I went all the way round, cutting off the excess card, not the easiest thing to do completely neatly, even with a very sharp knife. The result wasn't too bad, though a little rough in places. Next, I cut out the card parts for the wagon exterior. Since all of the cuts were straight, I was able to do them with a metal ruler and a sharp knife. I coloured the edges of the parts. I didn't have a green marker that matched exactly, but I figured this would be close enough. Not ideal, but certainly better than leaving the edges white. I used a steel ruler to make the bends in the parts. The ends were glued onto the wagon first with rocket glue. Then the sides were glued in place with their ends wrapped around to give the black corner frames. Finally, I used a brown marker to try to make the tops of the walls look a bit better. And I fitted the wheels, popping the pointed ends of the axles into the bearings. So there's the first wagon essentially complete. I tried it on some two-rail track. It seemed to roll quite well. The only parts left on the sprues were the mountings provided for different types of couplings, should you decide to use those. I tried the wagon on a piece of 00 three-rail track. The metal pins on the couplings seemed to sit well clear of the track, although even if they touched they wouldn't make a short circuit as they're pushed into plastic. So now I'll move on to building the other kits, but I'll try to just address the differences from the first kit and things that I did differently. This second kit was for a 5-plank open wagon, so not much different from the first kit except that extension of the wagon walls wouldn't be required. All of the same parts except for the omission of wall extensions. This metal body required a bit more clean-up than the first. This is how the coupling springs are supposed to fit, with one arm outside the pin and the arm with the bent end on the other side of the coupling hook. This is supposed to allow the spring to push the coupling hook back straight. But in my experience this didn't work at all. The springs just weren't strong enough. I did try to close the spring up to make it push harder, but I couldn't really achieve anything. Here are the axle box parts, better formed with this kit than the ones from the first kit. I lost one of the bearings trying to get it into place. It pinged from my tweezers to who knows where, so I used a brass bearing from my spares supply, which I had to glue in place. I fitted the wheels earlier in the process. You can see my glued brass bearing at top left here. The wheels seem to turn okay. I measured the wheelbase again, another 9-footer. I fitted the brake parts after trimming off the unwanted pieces. It was actually a bit trickier fitting these with the wheels in place, so perhaps it would have been better to leave fitting the wheels until later. One of the brake levers broke. I don't believe that I applied any real force to it, so I think it pretty much came broken. I did my best to glue it back together with polycement. You can sort of see in the middle here in front of the wheel. You can see also that I've mangled the axle box again, trying to hold it and twist it into its fitting. I cut out and glued together the card interior. The same card interior part as for the 7-plank wagon was provided, so this time it's stuck up way above the metal body. I did my best to cut off the excess with a sharp knife. Not the easiest thing to do. It might have been better to test fit the card, mark it, and then cut it down before assembling it and gluing it in place. But it might have proved difficult to get an exact alignment with the top of the metal sides that way. The results of my trimming weren't entirely great. I cut out the parts for the exterior, much the same as before, just not quite so high. Again, I coloured the edges with a marker and made the bends with a metal ruler. I glued those parts in place. This left some white card and metal showing a bit at the top. I did my best to improve the look of the top by painting black with a fine brush. And here are those first two wagons coupled together on double-O track. Next I turned to the kit for the conflat wagon. This one had a much shallower metal body. It also came with only one sheet of card parts, since the parts were so much smaller. In this case, the holes for the pins were surrounded to some extent by recesses. One end of this flat body was a bit bent at right here, and I tried to straighten it with pliers. As before, I opened out the holes in the body where necessary. Even with the recesses, it was difficult to get a tidy result when melting the plastic pins, because, as I say, the plastic really tends to stick to the soldering iron as you melt it. I fitted the couplings and the axle mountings. This time I managed to get all 4 bearings in place. Actually, one did ping out of my tweezers, but I managed to find it this time. This time the distance between the axle boxes was 40 millimeters, indicating a 10-foot wheelbase. This meant that I was going to need to cut away the inner set of brake shoes, a little bit trickier than cutting off the outer ones. I did my best to cut away the inner parts, as shown here. And here are the brake parts prepared for fitting to the 10-foot wheelbase chassis. They fitted just the same, just extending a bit further. And I melted those pins on the inside. And fitted the brake levers and the wheels. Here is one of the Magni Simplex couplings with the spring fitted correctly. But as you can see, it's doing nothing. The coupling hook is to the side and the spring isn't pushing it back. And this was the case with the screws as loose as possible and lubricated. Those springs are just so feeble that they exert hardly any significant force at all. I painted the inside of the wagon sides as the instructions said to. This was necessary because only an interior floor was provided as card. There was really no need to try to do this painting neatly, as the card parts would hide any excess paint. Next I needed to cut out the card parts. This was particularly fiddly in the case of this conflat kit, as the sides included complicated folding chain pockets. Here's the illustration from the instruction sheet showing how those chain pockets are supposed to go together. As you may imagine, cutting these out wasn't the easiest thing. Here are the card parts cut out. I edged the floor with a black marker and did my best to glue it in place. I couldn't really get it to fit properly flat because of all the melted plastic pin ends. Making up the chain pockets was rather a challenge. I bent the tabs back first. Then I bent the sub-tabs inwards. Then the boxes needed to be folded round and glued to those tabs, but it was difficult to fold and glue such very small pieces of card precisely. I did my best. Fortunately, only the outside of these chain pockets will normally be seen. In hindsight, I think it might have been better to make something solid around which to fold and glue the chain pockets rather than trying to rely on the little tabs. I used a brown marker to colour the card edges. Not the neatest job, but not a disaster. Here's the other side of that wagon. And here are the 3 wagons coupled together on double-O track. The final kit I had was for a box van, marked for the Worthington Brewery in Burton-on-Trent. I believe one of my uncles told me that he inherited some money from an aunt or a great-aunt whose family owned a brewery in Burton. This kit came with the same metal body as the 5 and 7 plank open wagons. Plastic parts were provided for the upper section of the van, just 2 parts, one for the walls and one for the roof. The roof part had a rather nasty sprue connection on one side. I did my best to trim that off and sand the edge down neatly. Not perfect, but not too bad. All of these kits had packing slips on the instruction sheet initialed and dated by the packer. They dated from 1977 to 1980. As mentioned, the metal body was just the same as for the open wagons. This one actually required the most drilling and cleaning, since quite a few of the holes didn't go all the way through. There was also some flash on the plastic pins that needed to be cleaned off before things would fit together properly. With that done, I fitted the sole bars and buffer beams. Here's one of the Magni Simplex couplings again. You can see the end of the spring against the side of the coupling hook, but as I say, so far as I can see, it doesn't really do anything useful, not being strong enough. Here are the axle boxes with their bearings fitted. I had a better time fitting these, finding that it was easier to rest the axle box on a finger and then press the bearing in with my thumb, which seems rather crude, but actually worked out better. Another change that I made with this kit was that I fitted the axle boxes to the metal frames before fitting those frames to the body. This made the fitting of the axle boxes much easier without the body and the sole bars getting in the way. I can't imagine why the instructions didn't say to do it like this in the first place. Here is one of the metal frames with the axle box parts fitted, and fitted neatly without any mangling. Here are both of them. You can see better here how the axle box parts with their springs fit into the metal frame and are able to move up and down. Having the axle box parts already fitted didn't make fitting the metal frames to the body any more difficult. I measured, and this was again a 9-foot wheelbase. I trimmed the brake parts and fitted them, and then fitted the wheels and the brake levers. Next, I needed to fit the top of the wagon box, as shown here. I glued the roof to the walls with polycement, and then glued that assembly to the metal body with 3-in-1. All of the card parts for these kits were very nicely printed, and textured as well. They're not only printed in colour, they have like plank texturing and screws, etc. The parts were a bit harder to cut out in this case, as the curved tops of the ends had to be done freehand, which I struggled to do precisely. I edged all of the card parts with brown and black marker as appropriate. The folds on the end of these parts were smaller than on the open wagons, making it trickier to fold them precisely. I did my best to make all of the folds. The ends glued onto the wagon first, fitting under the roof and folding round the corners. Then the sides glued on with their ends folded around the corners, forming the black metal braces for the corners. When I fitted the card against the roof, there was a strip of metal left exposed at the bottom. I tried to colour this with a marker to make it less noticeable. And here is the box van completed. I didn't build this one, I picked it up ready built, but I'm just showing it here as an example of yet another variant of these kits. This is a 3-plank wagon, so pretty much the same as the 5-plank wagon, but presumably coming with a metal body appropriately sized shallower. Here's the bottom of that wagon, exactly the same as the kits that I built. Here are all 5 wagons, the 4 I built and that extra one, coupled together on 00 track on the bench. I used a railer to rail up the wagons on my 3-rail tabletop. When I coupled a brake van with a metal simplex coupling to one of the wagons with a Magni simplex coupling, they derailed as soon as they hit a curve. So, since the other end of this brake van had no coupling, I figured I'd try to fit a Magni simplex coupling to it so that it could couple with the wagons. I fitted a Magni simplex coupling to the brake van, screwing it onto the existing coupling fitting. And here are the wagons coupled up as a train. First the 5-plank wagon, the 7-plank wagon, the conflat, and the box van. I did consider painting the roof of the box van, but it seemed these vans actually had pretty dark roofs. And here they are, all railed up behind an N2. However, as you'll see, I couldn't really get this train to run successfully because of problems with the magni-simplex couplings. Well, I'm afraid the end of this story is sad. Basically, you can't really run these wagons because those magni-simplex couplings are just hopeless. The springs have no power in them, they have no ability to push the coupling in at all. If the springs worked, if the springs were powerful enough to push the couplings into line, then they'd probably stay coupled, but they aren't. The springs are in no way strong enough to push the couplings into line. And so they just don't work. They come uncoupled all the time. Yeah, see what I mean? That's what happens. They just come uncoupled all the time. It's hopeless. You can't build runnable wagons like this because they don't work. I don't know. Do I have the patience to take all of those magni-simplex... Oh, I've derailed one as well now, but do I have the patience to take all of those magni-simplex couplings off and replace them with something else? I don't know. Obviously, one solution would have been to remove all of the magni-simplex couplings and replace them with metal simplex couplings, which generally work fine so long as they're not bent out of shape. I think I probably did have enough metal simplex couplings on hand to do that, but it would have been quite a bit of work and would have used up most of my stock of metal simplex couplings. As an immediate fudge, I just tightened up the screws on all of the magni-simplex couplings so that they couldn't pivot at all. Of course, this meant that you couldn't couple two wagons together just by pushing them together. You had to actually lift one wagon to fit its coupling hook into the coupling hook of the other wagon. But I figured that at least there was a better chance of the magni-simplex couplings staying coupled to each other if they couldn't move to the side. If the springs were actually strong enough to push the couplings into the straight position firmly, this wouldn't be necessary. It's pretty much a dead loss trying to get these wagons to run in a train even when they're locked from turning, because the slightest hesitation makes them uncouple, and unfortunately 3-rail trains have a tendency to hesitate, so... Well, we got them around a couple of times there, but... The real problem is these magni-simplex couplings are a bit of a dead loss, let's face it. It's very hard to make them stay coupled. I'm sorry, I'm shaking now. My health isn't very good and I've been really struggling with this. Now, well, we got them around a few times. That's about all I can do, really. I haven't even got the controller in my hand because I'm struggling so much with this stuff. Well, that's the best I can do. We got him to run around a few times there. I was running him with an 8F there because he's at least a bit of a more solid engine. He's less prone to hesitate on the points. That's really all I can do.